Good evening, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
And happy Malaysia Day to everyone watching. We thought this Malaysia Day would turn our attention to the Malaysia Agreement 1963 and the Special Cabinet Steering Committee on MA63. The August 31st deadline for the Special Cabinet Steering Committee to reach an agreement on all 21 issues of Sabah and Sarawak's autonomy has passed. Now, out of the 21 issues, only 7 have been resolved. In other words, we have two-thirds of the issues still outstanding, and this after months of negotiations. Joining us on the show today, we have Professor James Chin, who is the director of the Asia Institute of University of Tasmania in Australia. Welcome to the show, James.
Hi, Melissa.
Happy Malaysia Day to you.
Yes, happy Malaysia Day.
So what do you make, James, of the fact that only 7 have been resolved out of the 21 issues?
Well, I think you have to be realistic. I think it was always going to be very difficult in terms of negotiations. You're talking about items that were outstanding basically since the 1970s. Some of the items obviously could not be resolved. For example, SABAH, one of the claims they're making is that they wanted 40% of the tax in Sabah, and the federal government hasn't paid that since the 1970s. So you're talking about a huge amount of money.
And so they want it backdated.
Yes, obviously. When you start to negotiate, you always negotiate from,
a maximalist position.
That's right.
So the idea.
So that's one item. Some of the items which is originally not part of the Malaysia Agreement, but it's something that they also want to bring up. For example, I know that there's a lot of strong feelings in Sabah and Sarawak about who owns the petroleum and gas resources. Although they're not strictly part of the Malaysia Agreement, they also want to bring it up for discussion about who gets to keep what. So for example, in Sarawak, they've set out a special tax for the oil and gas industries, and recently they've just set up their own oil company as well, Petros, and Sabah is going to do the same thing. So I think a lot of the issues are interrelated, and for legacy reasons, they were never going to resolve all of it in a short period.
The 31st August deadline is a self-imposed deadline, right?
Yes,
but does it mean anything that they didn't meet the deadline? Does it feel like this is a lack of commitment in terms of the negotiation on their part?
Not really. I think what it means is that basically that the 7 issues, I wouldn't use the word resolve, it's just an agreement among the state government of Sabah, Sarawak and the federal government. But I think the other issues are much more complex. I think they need more time to study. And for the really core issues, I suspect it can only be resolved at a very, very high level. And here basically I'm talking about the agreement between the Prime Minister of Malaysia and the Chief Minister of Sabah and the Chief Minister of Sarawak.
So basically the leaders of 3 different territories.
Yes.
I want to ask you this, James. Sometimes when we talk about MA63, there's a tendency to kind of deal with the issue in a kind of legalistic framework, like that if we follow the letter of the law and the agreement, then all things will be resolved. But is it simply about the law, or is it more about the politics, the relative power, the shifting power dynamics across the Federation that really is determining how these talks pan out?
The thing about Malaysia is that everything here is political. It is, of course, I mean, as Malaysians, we understand that nothing is economics, everything is political. So even for agreement or the Malaysia agreement, at the end of the day, it's a political issue and have to be resolved at a political level. An example of that is, of course, in terms of how much money you give back to the states, development funding, what sort of models you follow, all those are actually political decisions, including something as simple as building the Pan-Borneo Highway. If you go back to the newspapers, the first time the Pan-Borneo Highway was actually spoken about was actually before independence. And the reason why...
Really? That far back?
Yes. Even during the British time, right, they were talking about building a road that will link Kuching all the way up to North Borneo then. And the reason why we have the Pan-Borneo being put on the priority list essentially is because in 2008, UMNO lost its majority. It required the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak to hold UMNO up in power. And that's also the reason why, after 2008, the old administration under Najib granted the 1 billion slash fund to both Sabah and Sarawak. So I think everything is coming together now simply because politically speaking, Sabah and Sarawak are becoming much more important. And obviously last year's regime change would not happen, for example, if Warisan did not come on board from the Sabah side.
What about the criticism that this is essentially elite politics, right? The elites of Sabah, Sarawak versus the peninsula-based elites, as opposed to saying that this is really a popular movement, the feeling of being disenfranchised, or being left out of development, or being marginal to mainstream development. What's the mix between the elite dynamics and also the popular dynamics in your mind?
I think this is one of the very few issues in Sabah, Sarawak, where the elites and the people in the street, or the orang kecil in the streets, they all are in agreement that for the last 60 years, Sabah and Sarawak was marginalized in the system, and that we must come together and decide what we want to do, especially in terms of implementation of MA63. I think everything came together for two reasons. The first is something that I mentioned, which is after 2008, Sabah and Sarawak MPs became much more important. But I also think that the second reason why these issues are coming up is because of social media. Previously, people who were interested in this could not organize together. Now you have lots of grassroots organizations in Sabah and Sarawak promoting this idea of MA63, promoting the idea of state nationalism. All this could not have happened without social media.
Well, we often speak of Sabah and Sarawak, in duality, right, together. I guess I just want to understand the differences. When it comes to the 21 issues that were being negotiated, 13 relate to both Sabah and Sarawak, but 8 relate to Sabah alone. So, talk to me a bit about the differences between the response to MA63 between the two different states.
Basically, there is no difference. I mean, both of them want MA63 to be implemented. The difference is the rhetoric coming out. When you hear the rhetoric about succession, state nationalism, demonstration, all those things are coming out of Sarawak for the very simple reason that we're heading towards an election in Sarawak, and both sides are positioning themselves. In Sabah, we don't have that problem because Warisan is an ally of Pakatan Harapan. And also in Sabah, the dynamics are different because the big change between back in 1963 and the current Sabah is demography. We know that in the 1980s and 1990s, there was this thing called Project M, where Sabah's demography was profoundly changed. So even today, the government has finally admitted that 1/3 of the population in Sabah are actually not born in Sabah. And in fact, as we speak, there's a lot of controversy in Sabah now because the federal government has just announced that they're going to issue a new type of paperwork for those illegal people who are staying in Sabah. And many of my friends in Sabah are telling me that this is very dangerous because once you issue the new paperwork, probably the next step after this will be they'll be given a blue IC or Malaysian citizenship. So there's actually a lot of controversy in Sabah. But again, it is not as vocal as in Sarawak because there's no state election coming in Sabah.
Okay, so this is again, ratcheting up for the state elections.
I do want to ask you though about the local legitimacy of the state governments, right? So you said Warisan is friendly towards Pakatan, but that relationship isn't a necessary one. Warisan could choose to ally itself to anybody else in terms of federal politics, couldn't it? And similarly, in Sarawak, you have this situation where the Gabungan Party Sarawak is potentially an ally now that it's sort of dropped the Barisan Nasional demeanor or cachet. What's the dynamic like possibly going into the future? I mean, could they ally themselves to PAS UMNO if they choose to see them as potentially delivering what they want? In terms of state development and such?
I think it's highly unlikely they'll go with the PAS UMNO combo. I think in terms of Sarawak, I think the thinking is that if, for example, GPS wins big at the next Sarawak state election, they'll probably to come to some sort of accommodation with the federal Pakatan Harapan. They probably will not join Pakatan Harapan, but they'll sign some sort of MOU like Warisan did. Most people forget that Warisan is not a formal member of Pakatan, but they rule together with Pakatan in Sabah. And I suspect that will happen, but only if GPS wins big. So everything really hinges on the Sarawak election.
But does that mean that in some ways the choices are limited for Sarawakians? I mean, what would be the differentiating factor for both? I mean, are Sarawakians given to believing the more extreme end of the spectrum in terms of state rights?
easier for us to implement MA63 if the state government is not an opposition government. That's the first thing. And also secondly, they said that we will really follow the spirit of MA63, and also that we will put in a direct chief minister. And this is something that the indigenous community in Sarawak has been asking for many, many years. People often forget that one of the things about Sarawak is that for the longest time, basically from 1970 up to just a very few years ago, the Sarawak political establishment was basically ruled by a single family. And a lot of people are quite unhappy about it. And there's a general consensus that during that long period, the people who paid the heaviest price was the local indigenous community. And it was always understood that, that maybe it's time to put the indigenous back in the chief minister's post. People keep forgetting that unlike SABAH, the two first chief ministers in Sarawak were actually indigenous Ibans.
All right, we're going to continue this conversation in just a couple of minutes. Stay here on Awani with Consider This. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me, Sharad Kutan. We're celebrating Malaysia Day with Professor James Chin, Director of the Asia Institute at the University of Tasmania in Australia, talking about the Sarawak state elections, which is happening, I guess, a year earlier. If it happens next year, which is as anticipated, it's a year earlier than scheduled. So the question is, James, what can we expect coming up from the Sarawak state elections? We talked a bit about the importance of MA63 in the upcoming elections. What about some of the voting tactics that you're expecting?
Sure. I think the big thing to watch out for is the split within the coalition. So there is a general understanding in Sarawak now that the most solid block of voters will be the Melanau Muslim Malay voters. That vote is unlikely to move, so it will probably stay with GPS. The vote that will probably shift will probably the Bidayu and the Ibang community. That's one thing. But in terms of the tactic, what is really interesting about Sarawak is that Sarawak separates the state election from the federal election. It is the only state left. So this gives the voters in Sarawak a very privileged position. They can actually split their vote, like what you had here in the Penang in the bad old days. So in other words, one of the tactics that I'm sure GPS will be using is that they'll probably say that, if you're unhappy with the federal government or you're happy with the federal government, you can support Pakatan Harapan, but at the state level, you have to support state-based party. So you can have the best of both worlds.
And along with that is, as you say, the bad old days when governments at the federal level played a kind of developmental politics, right? Which is that they denied states in opposition development funding, or they minimized it as a way of squeezing local populations to vote in favor of federal parties. Now, is that happening now, or do we see this dynamic? Is Pakatan Harapan playing that old Barisan Nasional game?
They are in some ways. So some of the money that supposedly goes to GPS has been stopped. So basically the sort of money that's going down to the ground now are actually money from Sarawak's reserve. But I think those things to me are not very important. What is very important now is that the people are actually given a choice. There's real competition. People living in this side of Malaysia often do not realize that there has never been a choice in Sabah and Sarawak for so many years. And that's the reason why you had the standard joke that Sabah and Sarawak are fixed deposit. So for the very first time, they're actually given a choice. And politicians in Sarawak will actually have to fight for the votes, which I think is actually a very good thing.
But didn't Sabah have quite a number of changes of government? I mean, they might be co-opted finally by federal government, but we did see some shifts, right? The rise of Bajaya, the rise of PBS, all of them, as it were, from the opposition taking power in the state.
Not really, because the so-called economic recession only happened in the PBS years. But that only happened after 1990 when PBS pulled out the federal government. But earlier on, it really did not happen. But even when they pulled out the federal government, they only lasted for 4 years. So in 1994, the Barisan Nasional basically engineered defections. PBS won the state election, but they engineered a defection and the government fell. What is unique in Sabah's political history is not so much that federal-state relationship or the migrant issue. politically, the most interesting thing was actually Sabah state was the only one who had this thing called the rotational chief minister, where all the three ethnic groups or three major political groups are given a chance to be a chief minister for 2 years. Now, that was an interesting experiment.
And did it pan out? Did it work? Okay. I want to shift the conversation slightly, James. You know, you brought up the divide between West Malaysia, East Malaysia, right? Some of the things that are important to Peninsular Malaysia doesn't quite gel in the narrative of East Malaysia, especially Peninsular Malaysia's obsession, if I may, with Malay supremacy and Islam. And how does that factor into the conversations that are being had in Sabah and Sarawak, particularly you know, with the talk about state nationalism and in the backdrop of the Sarawak state elections?
Well, I think it does feature in a lot of political conversations because Sarawakians like to pride themselves for having the best relationship. They always tell people outside Sarawak that Sarawak is one of the few places in Malaysia where the so-called kopitiam, you got people selling the halal food.
Right next to the non-halal food,
right,
and people eating
yes.
and not caring. Yeah.
The other example they like to give is that, you know, it's very common in many rural areas in Sarawak where the mosque is just 50 meters away, 100 meters away from a church or a temple. So they like the narrative that religious differences between Islam and non-Islam is not as sharp as you have in Peninsular Malaysia. But again, these sort of issues doesn't really, for me, right, is not really important. What is really important is that Sabah and Sarawak will have to catch up and have to make up for lost time after the long marginalization. The reality is that, and this is really shocking, that, you know, despite being in Malaysia or the Federation of Malaysia for so many years, poverty is still a huge problem. The rural interiors of Sabah and Sarawak, some of areas have actually no pipe water. Some of them are still running on generators. Some of the schools in the rural areas are really shocking. In other words, those people are not given a chance. If you're born in an isolated village, basically, you know, your chances of succeeding in life is really far, far behind, say, a baby born in Pakistan.
So the realities of people living in poverty in Sabah and Sarawak, I think, outweigh the kind of polemics when it comes to political Islam. But what does that mean? I mean, you know, if we were to focus on the kind of narrative that we're seeing coming out of which we expect to see, in fact, coming out of this PAS-UMNO collaboration, we expect to see ratcheted up, you know, racial and religious polemics. Would that alienate East Malaysia more from, you know, rather than bridging the divide?
Well, this thing is nothing new. You have to remember during the era when Barisan Nasional was in charge, they tried to impose this West Malaysian brand of Ketuanan Melayu, Ketuanan Islam thing. They tried to export the model to Sabah and Sarawak. I think they were quite successful in Sabah, but they've never been successful in Sarawak. So I don't expect that to change. What I expect is that if UMNO and PAS are successful, I think basically what will happen is that the Sarawak polity will actually become more nationalistic. They will even build a higher wall because the idea is that we want to keep out this sort of toxic religious politics out of Sarawak. So in some ways, they will actually build a higher wall rather than anything else.
In terms of the numbers game at the federal legislature, the parliament, do you see any possibility of Sarawakian or Sabah-based political parties aligning with PAS-UMNO in order to kind of achieve some sort of leverage?
Purely numbers game.
Yeah, because, you know, because it would be perhaps a kingmaker situation for both Sabahan and Sarawakian parties in a scenario where Pakatan perhaps weakens against UMNO-PAS coalition.
They will only decide on that on election night. So they will look at the actual election results before they decide everything. Don't forget, on the 9th of May, when the election result came out, we know that somebody from GPS immediately flew to Kuala Lumpur to try to cut a deal. It was not successful, but this gives you an idea of what happens. Same thing in Sabah, when the results were very close, one of the BN party jumped across, and suddenly they had a new government. So
they're very pragmatic.
Yes, they're very pragmatic, and they always go with the winners. And I don't expect that sort of political culture to change.
Well, okay, so looking at other scenarios, what do you think because we are kind of celebrating National Day, are there ways in which we can bridge the gap? Because some of the critics are saying that the kind of rhetoric against West Malaysians has gone beyond the realities of marginalization to a kind of almost toxic blaming of West Malaysians for everything under the sun. Is there, do you agree with that? And if so, is there any way of changing the narrative so that we can, as it were, hang together as a federation, perhaps with more equal terms, but still hold together as a federation?
I think in terms of national narrative, this problem is not unique to Sabah and Sarawak. I think if you look at the Federation of Malaysia, we've never resolved the core issue when Malaya became independent in 1957. What sort of nation are we trying to build? Are we building a Malay nation, or are we building a multicultural nation, or are we building a modern nation, a progressive nation? I think that question hasn't been resolved. What has happened in Malaysian politics in the last, especially the last 20 years, is we've seen a rise of political Islam, and that Islam is being used as an issue to cover everything else. So many of the key issues facing this country, right, never gets resolved because people are using Islam as the main mobilization for the polity, and you use Islam to cover up everything else.
Well, in the couple of minutes that we have left, James, just as we are celebrating Malaysia Day, I just want to get your personal thoughts. I mean, what do you hope to see this Malaysia Day in light of everything that we've discussed here tonight?
Well, what I'm hoping for is that over the next 3 years before the next general elections, I'm hoping that this issue of Malaysia Agreement will be firmly on the table, and that there will be some sort of accommodation between the federal government and the state government in Sabah and Sarawak, and that far more importantly, I hope to see everybody in the federation, not only Sabahans and Sarawakians, but also Malaysians as a whole, recognize the true history of the federation, the formation of Malaysia, and also recognize that their compatriots in Sabah and Sarawak has been marginalized, and that something must be done to allow the people of Sabah and Sarawak to catch up. And it's not really a question of that we're taking resources away. It's a question of being fair to everybody, and I think that's extremely important. What I'm really concerned about is that that the narrative and the sort of toxic politics that we see here in Malaya will actually consume everything, and that before the next election, Sabah and Sarawak issues will disappear again. And if that were to happen, I think it would not be a good thing, because you are feeding that sort of toxic stuff into a small group in Sabah and Sarawak, and they may want to try something else which may not be good for the Federation in the future.
There you go. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today, James. That's all the time we have on Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris with Mitra Kute. We're wishing you happy Malaysia Day. We'll catch you again same time tomorrow. See you then.